So, good morning.
Morning.
Thanks for being here. Welcome to this conversation. And we could start off with each of us introducing ourselves. If you wouldn't mind, if you want to share your preferred pronouns, what you do for the college, maybe also how long you've been here at Bowdoin, that would be great. Place to start.
I'm Sarah Seams. I'm the director of the McKeen Center for the Common Good, and I use she, her, hers pronouns. And I have been at Bowdoin for 15 years now.
Wow.
Yeah.
Nice. And I'm Roland Mendiola. I serve as the interim director of counseling and wellness services. I'm also a licensed clinical psychologist, and this is my 5th year being at Bowdoin. And just as I do in every episode of this, just wanting to provide just very brief context for why we're doing this. The basic inspiration was to allow both students and anyone wanting to hear, view these conversations, opportunity to access staff at Bowdoin and maybe on a more personal level, and particularly exploring this intersection of culture, identity, mental health, and the social stigma that can come with any of those pieces. So thank you again. I really appreciate you taking the time to
Sure.
do that and to talking with me today. So to get started, the first question is, did you grow up, Sarah, talking about mental, emotional health issues? And if so, how? Or if not, why not?
I don't think that I grew up with much conversation around mental health. I grew up in Western Maine, about an hour and a half from Brunswick, a really small town, Greenwood, which is in the Western foothills. And it's not the most rural part of Maine, but it's a little bit more rural. And grew up with a pretty, I would say, lower middle class, working class family and background. And I don't think there was a whole lot of talk about things like mental health or counseling or self-care. I think there was a lot of love in my family, but we didn't necessarily delve deeply into the emotional side of things. And I don't think I even knew anyone who ever used a counselor until I was probably in college, or at least said that they used a counselor. It certainly wasn't talked about if anyone did. So in terms of why not, I think there's a cultural class component to that, in where I grew up, and a general feeling of, some parts of life are hard and you have to get through it. And not that there couldn't be hard times, but that you kind of had to figure out how to deal with things. And I think there was definitely, at least what I felt anyway, was that I need to be strong and to not let my emotions get to me, that type of thing. What's interesting, I think, is later in life, especially now with my family, I think it's a totally different, norm in my family now. And there's a lot more discussion around mental health than there was when I was growing up. And maybe there could have been more when I was growing up, but I think it just didn't seem like something that was easily talked about then.
It's interesting that the way you phrased it and the kind of logic I think a lot of us grew up with, that we almost equate being strong with not letting our emotions get to us.
Yeah, which is not how I think anymore, for sure. But there was kind of that overall, that feeling of if things were getting to you, that was, for me, I interpreted that as weakness. Like if I couldn't get past something, that felt like weakness. And that was something when my first time going into counseling when I was in my 20s, that was definitely the first thing that my counselor pointed out to me, and tried to get me to start to rethink, for sure, which I've had to work on a lot over the years. It takes some retraining if that's what you felt, even if you weren't told it directly, if that's how you kind of felt growing up, it takes a while to move through that.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
It's still sometimes happening.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Well, if you could, I think some of these things can really benefit potential listeners. Like breaking down, how might you break down like what it means, like things getting to you, like?
Well, I think there's different ways that I would interpret that, and it might be helpful to give some family background too for me and my kind of journey with mental health and with counseling as well.
Sure.
At the end of my freshman year of college, my mom was diagnosed with breast cancer. And that was definitely a turning point in my family in terms of, at least from my experience with my family, in terms of talking about emotion and impact and self-care. I think I felt at that point that, before that, I wouldn't have considered us to be a super affectionate family, but that changed pretty quickly with my mom's diagnosis. And it was stage 4 with her diagnosis. So, I can remember some really tough conversations with my dad about what this all meant. And him having to really spell out for me that it meant that she was going to die from breast cancer, that we didn't know when, but that this was going to be the cause of her death. And, I went through the rest of my college career with my family dealing with that and my mom fighting, and the rest of us, I don't know, kind of coping however best we could. But I remember, I think back on it now, and there was a counseling office at my college, but I did not use it. I think in my mind, there was a stigma around counseling. And I don't even remember anyone suggesting that I see a counselor. Like it just wasn't, no one I knew was doing that. And it wasn't anything that I was familiar with. So I didn't have any counseling until after my mother passed away, and she lived another 5 years after her diagnosis and passed away when I was 23. And I started having panic attacks. I think I started having panic attacks a little before she passed away. I don't think they started after she passed away, but certainly the frequency increased when she passed away. And I saw a grief counselor for just a few sessions. It was something through, a lot of workplaces have employee services where you can access mental health support. And that was how I learned about that. And I went to just a few sessions, but enough so that I came to understand and know what a panic attack was, because I didn't know what it was. I had never really heard of them or had anyone describe one to me. I thought I actually had a really bad experience with a doctor, like my primary care physician, who, when I described what was happening to me, which included for me, I don't know if it's the same for everyone, but it was a lot of just internal, like no one could have looked at me and known that I was having a panic attack, but internal confusion and anxiety and really not being able to focus. The doctor never even said anything to me about that it could have been a panic attack or anything going on with me emotionally or mentally, and ended up doing tests, like physical medical tests, without it ever bringing up anything else. It was not a great experience. But when I went to this grief counselor, he was able to talk to me about what panic attacks were and helped me to at least identify what was happening and think through strategies like just making sure that I had options. If I felt trapped in a situation, like what could options be for me to leave, to cope? Who were people that I could reach out to if I needed help? Just talking through some really what turned out to be just basic things helped so much to know and identify what was going on. So I would say that was kind of my first experience with a counselor, or with realizing that something was going on with me that I needed to address. And I think that was really helpful to me, but I wasn't actually addressing the grief of losing my mother. It was really specifically about these panic attacks. And I tried I remember one of the worst panic attacks I had came when I bought a book for myself that was about grief, because I said, okay, my mom died. I need to figure out how to deal with this. So I'll read a book and I'll figure this out, and then I can get past it. And I bought that book, and I had one of the worst panic attacks ever, which at the time, I don't know if I really made sense of, but looking back on, I think I was trying to force myself to have like a really specific plan that I could get through this thing and get over it and move on, which is not how grief works. But I certainly have learned over the years. And so it was, I think, important for me to have some time to sit with my grief. And I really didn't for a while. I think I, didn't really talk to many people about it. I didn't talk with my family about it. I had a few really close friends who knew my mom and who I could talk to, but it wasn't something that I was really open about, or even consciously. I don't think I consciously chose not to deal with it. I think I just, again, like, you move on. Life is hard and you move on. And so it wasn't until a few years later, actually several years later, I think, that I had a rough breakup of a relationship. And I think that kind of triggered some stuff for me. And I started to have some pretty strong anxiety. And that was when I first started seeing a counselor that I stayed with for a while. And that was the counselor who really worked with me to not be so hard on myself about things, because I felt like, I didn't feel like I could control this anxiety. And that was really hard for me to feel like I wasn't in control of it. And so with a lot of time with her, it got better over time, but it really took a while to work through. And I think it's hard to know for sure how much of that was about the loss of my mother, but it certainly felt connected to me. And I think that was when I definitely started to talk more with other people, and had friends open up to me about things that they had been through as well. And just that feeling of not being alone with it, I think, was really impactful for me as well. So I would say those are kind of a lot of my challenges over the years, which sometimes have been worse than others, have been around anxiety and around grief. Today, I've had periods where I've been with a counselor for a long time, and one of my counselors who I was with ended up retiring, and that was hard. I think one of the things that can be really difficult about therapy is, well, first of all, getting started and feeling comfortable sharing your story with someone that you've just met. And then as you build trust, feeling connected and like you are really making progress with a therapist is important. But then if that relationship ends, especially for someone who has dealt with grief, that can be hard as well. And it took me a while to go back to counseling after she retired. And I've seen a few therapists since then. Right now I'm with someone that I feel like I'm making some good progress with. And this relationship is a different one, because I went to her in preparation for some things that I knew were coming up in my life that would be hard. And so now I feel like I'm a lot more proactive with my mental health. And I was, I knew that the things that were coming up were probably going to trigger anxiety for me. And so I went to her to prepare for that. And it really was very helpful to have that relationship established. And to be able to have a constant touch point. And there are times where, I still see her now. There are times where I'm like, I don't know if I really need this. Like, I'm in a good place. I don't know if right now I need to be in counseling. But every time I talk with her, of course, there's more to talk about. And so I think for me, and this is a choice I've made, it's important for me to keep a relationship and keep a touch point with a therapist.
Yeah. I think that's really helpful to acknowledge that piece too, of there's a balance there between and at different times of like how much we need it and allowing it to be there because it has a certain kind of usefulness probably anytime, but also acknowledging when we don't need it maybe as actively. Thank you so much, Sarah, for sharing all of that. And I'm always so appreciative the quality of how you share these parts of yourself and your life. If people don't know you and your story, you've been so generous over the years about offering your experience and your insight and perspective on this to Bowdoin. For how long were you doing the grief group?
So Melissa Quimby started it probably around 2007, maybe. I'm guessing here. She connected with a student, Melissa. I don't think she would mind us sharing because she shares with students all the time. She had a loss while she was in college as well, and she connected with a Bowdoin student who had lost a parent, and they decided to start bringing other students together. And I joined them a year or two later after they started it.
Okay.
And it was specifically early on, it was for students who had lost parents, and we just called it grief group. And it was, I think because that had been the three of our experience of losing a parent, all three of us had actually lost our mothers. That felt like an important piece to focus on, but over the years it's broadened quite a bit, which I think has been really great for students. So I've been involved, not in the last few years. So over a span of 10 years or so, maybe I was involved. I'm not exactly sure, but I think it was really healing for me. So the group would meet usually once a month, but we really left it up to the students,
right?
In terms of how often they wanted to meet. And we just gave students a place to talk about what they were going through, because especially for college students, most of their peers had not had a significant loss, thankfully. Most people 18 to 22 may have lost a grandparent or other older relatives, but don't usually lose someone really close to them at that age. And when you do, and even if a grandparent can be a very close loss too, I don't mean to imply otherwise, but usually it's older people. And when you do lose someone really close to you, it's hard when you feel like no one understands what that feels like. So in my time in the group, we had students who had lost parents to illness or to sudden passing, students who had lost siblings, students who had lost friends, and other caretakers, surrogate parents, some students who had parents with long-term terminal illnesses who hadn't passed yet, but students, and that was my experience in college. Like my mom was still alive, but we were dealing with her illness constantly. So I think it's really grown to be something that can be for any student who's dealing with grief and loss, whatever that means to them. And for me to be a part of that, I think it was a turning point for me with my own grief, because I hadn't really talked about it with people. I think it was hardest to talk about with my family. I think sometimes the people who have experienced the same loss, it's so near the surface that can feel hardest. So having other people who understood but weren't in the same loss with me was really helpful. We would talk about, certainly, like we shared our stories of loss and who we had lost. And sometimes people would go into a lot of detail. Mm-hmm. Other times students would just listen. A lot of times we would find ways to laugh together. And sometimes it would be what some people would consider to be like a morbid sense of humor. But when you when you understand what that loss is, you can let that side of things come out more
Yeah.
with people who understand.
Yeah.
And that's really healing as well.
Yeah. All these
so-
different sides I've seen
Yes.
in action be so helpful to students.
Yeah. So for me, it was both my own processing because I shared my own experiences in that group, but it was also about helping other people. And not surprising with the job that I do, I do think that helping others is incredibly healing. And it has been for me. I remember my mom passed away in April of 2003. And about a month later, I started volunteering as a youth field hockey coach with fourth and fifth grade girls. And I remember the first day I was driving home from that practice. I remember it being like one of the first times I felt happy again after my mom passed away and feeling like, oh, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. Right. Because it gave me a focus. It was these adorable little girls that didn't hurt, who were just learning what field hockey even was. But to have a role in helping those kids gave me a focus and gave me a purpose that I really needed at that point. So yeah. I think that act of reaching out and supporting other people, it really is a self-healing action as well.
Yeah. A couple other pieces I appreciate about your journey as you shared it, Sarah. One, I think a lot of us resonate with in terms of the struggle with our own health and well-being. This piece about like almost having to hit a wall with it before we can even fully acknowledge like there's something going on and I need support with it. When you were talking about that breakup and the anxiety that ensued. But then also this piece I would love us to maybe even unpack for a minute, which I don't have an answer for. I mean, I don't think there's an easy answer for this message that I think you got, maybe a lot of us get around some version of like life is hard and you just have to deal with it. Yeah. And then it naturally for me begs the question of like, yes, I mean, I think we all can buy into that. And like, how hard should it be? Or like, is there a place you draw the line of like, well, I should just let it be this hard, or I'm just weak, or I'm, incapable or something? Or is there another way? How do I decide when life is actually too hard to just deal with the way I deal with it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think a lot of it does come from finding ways to listen to yourself and where your boundaries are, and having people in your life who can also, if you feel comfortable, having people that can help you recognize things too, because sometimes when you're in the thick of it, you don't necessarily recognize that you may be super stressed or you may be coping in ways that aren't healthy. And so having open communication with the people who care about you, for hopefully that you'd be open to them saying if they have, an observation, or it might not even be a big concern. It might just be like, I noticed you've been having a lot of headaches lately, like whatever the case may be. Keeping open to that kind of feedback, because it can be, there's so many times with my anxiety, when I have something that's going on and I'm really, the way my anxiety works is I overthink things a lot. Like I have a problem and I just can't stop thinking about it, and it spins and it spins and it spins and it spins. It's really hard to disrupt that. And looking back on it, once I have, been able to address whatever it is, or at least time helps as well. Like, especially with my anxiety, like just sleeping on something the next day, usually things look differently. And I can look back on my reaction to something and say, wow, I was really worked up about that, maybe disproportionately. And that space gives me that ability to see it. So recognizing that other people may also be able to have that perspective and help you have that perspective has been important to me to recognize, to try to disrupt patterns and recognize like, I'm really upset right now. is, not that it's not okay to be upset, but,
Right.
is my reaction appropriate for this situation?
Is it about this, or is there?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I don't know if that answers your question, but I think
it absolutely does.
Yeah.
It makes me want to raise the point. It happened to me the other day where I was kind of in a sort of desperate emotional place, and thankfully I've gotten enough experience with this to like you said, like name it, like, oh, I think I'm spiraling right now.
Mm-hmm.
And enough, I don't know, okayness with myself that I did reach out to a friend. And amongst a lot of important things that he said, he was like urging me. He's like, brother, just like give this 24, 48 hours.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's going to look different, like give yourself some time. Like, I mean, he said a lot of other things, of course, but that was a piece that definitely did resonate.
Mm-hmm.
And I think has always been the case pretty consistently in my life when things feel like they're, and I guess I'm saying this for maybe students who can hear it, like we all or many of us hit these like really what feel like breaking points.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one thing for me when it can be really hard and it may not be the right choice for everyone. So I want to acknowledge that. But when I had kind of my first real strong episode with anxiety, I ended up kind of accidentally calling my dad. I was trying to reach my sister and I got my dad. And I wouldn't have called him normally. I think because of the way I interpreted our family and our dynamics, I wouldn't have felt comfortable calling him when I was having a really hard time. And it's the best mistake I've ever made in my life. I mean, he was amazing. And he showed me a side of himself that I hadn't either seen or recognized before in terms of his openness to conversations around mental health and how we need to take care of each other. And I remember him saying something really clear to me about, everyone in our family thought that you were doing great. Like, and if that's not the case, we want to know, and that's because we don't always, even the people closest to us, especially family, it can be really hard.
Right.
We don't always share when we're struggling. And I happened to have that vulnerability with him. And he was my rock as I dealt with things for a while. Like he really became the person that I turned to.
Wow.
And in a way that I would not have expected. So, I don't want to say that everyone should just pick up the phone and call their dad. That might not be the right person for you, but sometimes it is giving people a chance to.
Right. I think that is a great point. That you can be surprised by what you get back if you kind of take a little bit of a risk with being vulnerable. Yeah. So you've already, I mean, without any prompts, of course, like laid out beautifully, like this journey that you've been on. Anything else you would say, Sarah, about how the ways that who you are and where you come from have informed that journey for you? Any other aspects of yourself that?
Yeah, I think, what I've come to find out over the years, which was not something we talked about early on, but I think several people in my family have dealt with anxiety and depression, which I didn't know when I was a kid, and our family, I think, has grown to be able to talk about it in a way that is really important. And there's also a piece that I'm not a mental health professional, and I'm not a doctor, so I don't know about the kind of medical background around these diagnoses, but it certainly feels like there is maybe a genetic component too. And I think sometimes that again goes with the messages we tell ourselves about weakness, that we should just be able to get past stuff. And sometimes our bodies are telling us something, are dealing with something. And there comes a point where and I also am someone who has had migraines my whole life. And the pattern for me with migraines was always, I would get them when something stressful ended. And so when I started to relax, that's when a migraine would hit. And I think that there are messages that our bodies are sending us that it can take a bit to recognize, but that's a piece of it, again, that is validating for me around, like, this is not just about weakness and I should be able to just struggle through something. Like, my body is dealing with something and I need to recognize it, and help to my own body to get through whatever this is. So I think that family members becoming more open about their own challenges, I plan to be a lot more open with my kids than I heard about things when I was a kid, for sure. I talk to students all the time about therapy. I don't always share my own journey with it, but I think that a lot of students coming in now don't have the same stigma about therapy and counseling, which is fantastic, but there still can be a lot of guilt and weight around it, even if they're willing to seek help. And so I think that for me, growing up and with a family that I thought was not open to talking about it, and realizing over time that everyone actually really was open to talking about it, yes, has been really helpful, and has influenced my ability to now talk with students or other peers about it as well.
Yeah. I don't know all the data extensively either. I think that the short story that a lot of us in the field can agree upon is that there is a strong enough genetic component that it does make a difference. It exists within your family and you likely have a predisposition. And it never explains the picture in its totality. Sure. There are these pieces now that they're finding out about even how generational trauma works, where how things are encoded in your genes can play a role in your own experience of trauma. But then even there, like, so many environmental, social, cultural factors play all these important roles in how we actually experience our psychological, emotional life. So I think it's all to your point, though. I mean, that it's never just an individual like having issues, it's not like,
right. Yeah.
It's not like the problem is just like inside me or something. It's family, it's cultural, it's social. I think that's where most people can land on when it comes to all that. I feel like there's so many other kinds of questions I want to ask you about. Actually, yeah, one follow-up to that. You mentioned culture and class playing a role in this. I was wondering if you maybe could just speak to it a little bit more explicitly, like in your experience or in your view, like how those things shape our ways of dealing with these issues.
I think culture and class are probably interwoven for me on this front. Growing up I grew up in Maine and in Western rural Maine. So, predominantly white community, and not a lot of exposure to other cultures at all. So I think everything around me was pretty much white culture. Class, I think that's one of the other, I know one of the questions that you sometimes ask, like, what are the other things we don't talk about? And I think class is right up there. For me, growing up, I think that my family's background, on my dad's side in particular, was one of the pull yourself up by the bootstrap type of story. You know, my grandmother only got an 8th grade education and had my dad when she was 16, you know, was married and had 2 kids before she was 20 years old, and worked in mills and pretty working class stuff growing up. And my dad grew up in a house that didn't have indoor plumbing and electricity, you know, and you know, that I think there is a ruggedness. I don't know if that's the right word, but you know, when I say like life is hard, it was a whole lot harder for my dad than it was for me. You know, and growing up really with, you know, struggling financially, and really the answer to it all was hard work. And I've talked with my dad about class. I help facilitate intergroup dialogue on class here on campus. And so I've had some hard and really good conversations with my dad about his upbringing and how different it was from mine, but also how that impacts my view of class, knowing how close, you know, I'm only a generation out from poverty, really. I think when you have struggles like that you're facing every day, that are so immediate and in your face, you know, just being able to earn enough money to support your family, and the hard Maine winter when you have to just having to use an outhouse, you know, in the middle of the Maine winter, like that's not an easy, comfortable life. And so it can feel, I think, or seem that you're really working to meet basic needs, and that anything on top of that is, I don't like this because I don't believe this, but the impression sometimes is like it's an indulgence to spend time on other things when there's so much that is just an immediate need to take care of yourself and your family. And it may feel like you don't have time for that kind of care, that kind of self-care, when you have to make these other priorities. And, you know, my mom was a teacher, and my dad had a lot of different jobs growing up that ranged from, you know, he cut wood and he was basically a lumberjack, for lack of a better term. And he also worked on road crews, and he worked on an ambulance, and, you know, he did a lot of different jobs. He worked in a mill himself for a while, ended up going back to school when I was in college, and got a degree in computer technology, and was able to work in that field before he retired. So he had a bunch of different careers, but some of them were really physical, hard labor careers. And some of them were more kind of managerial or technology stuff. So he ran the range of things. And, you know, again, there's just this element of you do what you have to do to support your family, and that's your priority. And anything on top of that, not that it's not important to take care of yourself, but that there's not a lot of coddling in that type of environment. And there's an expectation that you work hard all the time. And that's what you do to get by. I would love to hear your thoughts on this and how it connects, because those feel really connected to me, but I'm finding it hard to articulate how that translates to these impressions around mental health.
For what it's worth, I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, there's so many feelings that come up as you're sharing this part of your story. And if nothing else, I just, it lands in this place of just reflecting on how, like, why spaces like intergroup dialogue are so powerful in intergroup dialogue. Because just it highlights for me like how much we don't see about other people's experience.
Right. Yeah.
And that's it's such a loss in my perspective of so much like that we of ways we are not connecting actually to people, because there's just so much, you know, there's consistently so much depth there in my experience of talking to people that you know, I think your sort of average person in that person's world, in your world, might not get access to. And I don't even know exactly what my point is, but it feels like such a loss. I don't know what if you would say anything more about it.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. And I think one of the things you said just now, just even mentioning the word access, unfortunately, mental health support is not always accessible to everyone. And it comes in terms of insurance. And I know a lot of therapists have really full workloads, and there's sometimes it can be hard to find someone who's taking new patients, and the cost of it can really be prohibitive. So when I think about those things too, like a lot of people, you know, in my community growing up, I don't think had healthcare. And so it wouldn't have even been an option, you know?
Would you argue, Sarah, that there were things in place in communities to offer that kind of support back in the day? It seems to me more traditionally speaking, than we have access to today. I mean,
I think for my community growing up, because it was so small and I felt like I was related to half the people in the town, you know, like there's a lot of, there's a big community support element. I'm really glad that you brought that up, because I think it may not be articulating things about mental health, but people look out for each other and they know when they're struggling. And, you know, my grandmother loved to cook and bake, and she spent most of her, you know, like retirement cooking food to give away to other people. And that was her way of caring about people and expressing support, and letting them know that someone was there. I think that community element is definitely something that can be really helpful and important. I don't think it's totally disappeared. You know, when I go home, I know there are a lot of still things that the thing that comes to mind for me is the fire department, because my dad was on the department for 50 years, was the chief of the volunteer fire department. And that was our place of community. And there were potluck dinners and there were Christmas gatherings. And that was a place that our community was centered around. And I think that still exists. But I think there are also so many other influences now as well, that some of that maybe has lost its place or isn't as big a place in our lives as it used to be, because and social media obviously comes to mind as another way that people are connecting, but it's not as in-depth and personal as the other ways that I experienced things when I was growing up.
As you're saying that, I definitely find as a young parent, like I feel like I'm going to have to be very intentional to build. We have some amount of community, but like to keep it sustainable and robust over time. Like, I just feel like it necessitates an intentionality that maybe wasn't as necessary before. I don't know. That's my general impression of society. But and I wonder about that piece, and I'm maybe acknowledging it because I think it's something that, no, I mean, I know students will actively say in counseling, like one of the reasons I chose Bowdoin was because it felt like there was a sense of community. Yeah, and I'm just always curious about how we're, fostering that.
And I think that's where I think the sense of community and about caring about other people outside of yourself, with our, the McKeen Center for the Common Good, I hear this a lot from students. They choose to come to Bowdoin, at least in part because of that commitment to the common good that they see with the college's identity. And I think that is, it draws a lot of students here, and it becomes a really significant part of their experience to figure out where does that fit into their life. into their studies, co-curricular, and becoming a member of a community is, again, like it's a reciprocal piece. We talk about reciprocity a lot in the McKeen Center because we want to encourage students to think of others and to think about how they can support and help communities, but we also want them to recognize how much they're gaining from it as well. And that when you go and volunteer somewhere or you have a summer fellowship somewhere, that, yeah, we want you to be helping that organization you're working with. And we also want you to be learning about what they do, about, what you want to do in the future. That relationship needs to be reciprocal for it to really be a healthy one, and not when it's one-sided, there's power dynamics that come in that are not great for anyone. And recognizing how much you gain from giving is a really important piece of that kind of work.
Yeah. Makes a lot of sense. Sarah, as we're wrapping up today, anything you want to share from your experience, something or any messages you want to convey to students, something that you feel like they might need to hear going through all they're going through right now?
I think it's just repetitive of what we talked about before, and it sounds a little cliche, but understanding that you're not alone, I think is a really important piece that has been helpful to me in my life. But I also see it with students and hear from students, especially in grief group, that knowing that other people understand, even if they're not in your shoes, they can still have some idea of what you're experiencing, is really important. And that you can be that for someone else too, to help someone else understand that they're not alone as well. I think is a key piece to our own journeys and healing as well.
That's super well said. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for doing this. I think it's
absolutely
fantastic.
How was this for you?
Yeah, this is great. I think it's I really wish that there had been more of this type of conversation and openness, talking about mental health when I was, like I said, when I was in college. I think I could have absolutely benefited from it. I think I needed it. And I wish that this existed then. What's that?
I was so stubborn for so many years.
Yes.
Yeah. I don't know if this would have gotten through, but I probably need a lot of different things trying to get at me. But I've got a lot of appreciation for you, Sarah. Thank you so much for who you are and what you do and everything you've shared today.
Thanks. I there's still pieces of me that have a hard time talking about it. I think that doesn't completely go away. But I really believe that I know it's helped me too. So
even more so that you're willing to do it is like, I think is very meaningful for people.
Yeah. Well, thank you for doing this. I think it's fantastic. It reminds me so much of like the podcasts that I listen to as well, like the interview podcasts I love. So I think it's really, I think it's a good mode. I hope, do you have any,
I'm enjoying
are we past the recording point basically?
Well, you stop.
This will get edited out, right? Well, I'm just curious if you know how many students are consuming it. Like, are you able to see numbers
I haven't checked in a while, but we could check the YouTube channel that it's
right. It's okay.
Everything
is. I hope students I hope it's reaching students, because I really do think that it's fantastic. And especially for students to hear from, like having Kristen Brennan and Eduardo and Benji, like people that they see in these other roles, talking about this is really fantastic.
Yeah, it's been great. Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah, thanks for doing it.